So, one great team of debaters deserves another, and arguing against our resolution, be it resolved what you call political correctness, I call progress, is the Emmy Award-winning actor, screenwriter, author, playwright, journalist, poet, and tonight debater, Stephen Fry. Thank you, Stephen. Stephen's teammate is a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, a YouTube sensation, and the author of the big new international bestseller, 12 Rules for Life. Ladies and gentlemen, Toronto's Jordan Peterson.
Hello. So we should first decide what we're talking about. We're not talking about my views of political correctness, despite what you might have inferred from the last speaker's comments. This is how it looks to me. We essentially need something approximating a low-resolution grand narrative to unite us. And we need a narrative to unite us because otherwise we don't have peace. What's playing out in the universities and in broader society right now is a debate between two fundamental low-resolution narratives, neither of which can be completely accurate because they can't encompass all the details. Obviously, human beings have an individual element and a collective element, a group element, let's say. The question is, what story should be paramount? And this is how it looks to me. In the West, we have reasonably functional, reasonably free, remarkably productive, stable hierarchies that are open to consideration of the dispossessed that hierarchies generally create. Our societies are freer and functioning more effectively than any societies anywhere else in the world and than any societies ever have. And as far as I'm concerned, and I think there's good reason to assume this, it's because the fundamental low-resolution grand narrative that we've oriented ourselves around in the West is one of the sovereignty of the individual, and it's predicated on the idea that all things considered, the best way for me to interact with someone else is individual to individual, and to react to that person as if they're both part of the process, because that's the right way of thinking about it, the psychological process by which things we don't understand can yet be explored, and by things that aren't properly organized in our society can be yet set right. The reason we're valuable as individuals, both with regards to our rights and responsibilities, is because that's our essential purpose, and that's our nobility, and that's our function. What's happening, as far as I'm concerned, in the universities in particular, and spreading very rapidly out into the broader world, including the corporate world, much to what should be its chagrin, is a collectivist narrative. And of course, there's some utility in a collectivist narrative because we're all part of groups in different ways, but the collectivist narrative that I regard as politically correct is a strange pastiche of postmodernism and neo-Marxism, and its fundamental claim is that no, you're not essentially an individual, you're essentially a member of a group. And that group might be your ethnicity, and it might be your sex, and it might be your race, and it might be any of the endless numbers of other potential groups that you belong to, because you belong to many of them. And that you should be essentially categorized along with those who are like you on that dimension in that group. That's proposition number one. Proposition number two is that the proper way to view the world is as a battleground between groups of different power. So you define the groups first, and then you assume that you view the individual from the group context, you view the battle between groups from the group context, and you view history itself as a consequence of nothing but the power maneuvers between different groups. That eliminates any consideration of the individual at a very fundamental level, and also any idea, for example, of free speech, because if you're collectivist at heart in this manner, there is no such thing as free speech. It isn't that it's debated by those on the radical left and let's say the rest of us, so to speak. It's that in that formulation, there's no such thing as free speech, because for an individualist, free speech is how you make sense of the world and reorganize society in a proper manner. But for the radical left type collectivist that's associated with this viewpoint of political correctness, when you speak, all you're doing is playing a power game on behalf of your group. And there's nothing else that you can do because that's all there is. And not only is that all there is in terms of who you are as an individual now and how society should be viewed, it's also the fundamental narrative of history. For example, it's widely assumed in our universities now that the best way to conceptualize Western civilization is as an oppressive, male-dominated patriarchy, and that the best way to construe relationships between men and women across the centuries is one of oppression of women by men. It's like, well, look, no hierarchy is without its tyranny. That's an axiomatic truth. People have recognized that literally for thousands of years. And hierarchies do tend towards tyranny, and they tend towards the usurpation by people with power. But that only happens when they become corrupt. And we have mechanisms in our society to stop hierarchies from becoming intolerably corrupt, and they actually work pretty well. And so I would also point this out. You know, don't be thinking that this is a debate about whether empathy is useful or not, or that the people on the con side of the argument are not empathetic. I know perfectly well, as I'm sure Mr. Fry does, that hierarchies tend to produce situations where people stack up at the bottom, and that the dispossessed in hierarchies need a political voice, which is the proper voice of the left, by the way, and the necessary voice of the left. But that is not the same as proclaiming that the right level of analysis for our grand unifying narrative is that all of us are fundamentally to be identified by the groups that we belong to and to construe the entire world as the battleground between different forms of tyranny in consequence of that group affiliation. And to the degree that we play out that narrative, that won't be progress, believe me, and we certainly haven't seen that progress in the universities. We've seen situations like what happened at Wilfrid Laurier University instead. We won't see progress. What we'll return to is exactly the same kind of tribalism that characterized the left.
Yes, I'll try and be as quick as possible, because if I miss that plane to London, I won't half hear the end of it from the bridegroom's mother. Now, in agreeing to participate in this debate and stand on this side of the argument, I'm fully aware that many people who choose incorrectly, in my view, to see this issue in terms of left and right, devalued and exploded terms as I think they are, will believe that I am betraying myself and such causes and values that I have espoused over the years. I've been given huge grief already simply because I'm standing here next to Professor Peterson, which is the very reason that I am standing here in the first place. I'm standing next to someone with whom I have, differences, shall we say, in terms of politics and all kinds of other things, precisely because I think all this has got to stop. This rage, resentment, hostility, intolerance, above all this with us or against us, certainty. A grand canyon has opened up in our world. The fissure, the crack, grows wider every day. Neither on each side can hear a word that the other shrieks, and nor do they want to. While these armies and propagandists in the culture wars clash, down below in the enormous space between the two sides, the people of the world try to get on with their lives, alternately baffled, bored, and betrayed by the horrible noises and explosions that echo all around. I think it's time for this toxic, binary, zero-sum madness to stop before we destroy ourselves. I'd better nail my colours to the mast before I get any further in this. It's only polite to give you a sense of where I come from. All my adult life I have been what you might call a lefty, a soft lefty, a liberal of the most hand-wringing milksop, milquetoast variety. Not a burning man-the-barricade socialist, not even really a progressive worth the name. I've been on marches, but I've never quite dared wave placards or banners. Am I a loathed member of that band, an SJW, a social justice warrior? I don't think highly of social injustice, I have to say, but I character myself mostly as a social justice warrior. My intellectual heroes growing up were Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore, liberal thinkers, people like that, writers like E.M. Forster, I believed, and I think I still do believe, in the sanctity of human relations, of the primacy of the heart and friendship and love and common interest. These are more personal, interior beliefs than they are political exterior convictions, more a humanistic version of a religious impulse, I suppose. I trust in humanity. I believe in humanity. I think I do, despite all that has happened in the 40 years of my adulthood. I am soft, and I can easily be swept away by harder hearts and harder intellects. I'm sometimes surprised to be described as an activist, but over time I have energetically involved myself with what you might call causes. I grew up knowing that I was gay. Well, in fact, from the very first I knew I was gay. I remember when I was born looking up and saying, that's the last time I'm going up one of those. I'm Jewish. So I have a natural horror of racism. Naturally, I want racism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, bullying, bigotry, intolerance of all human kinds to end. That's surely a given amongst all of us. The question is how such a golden aim is to be achieved. My ultimate objection to political correctness is not that it combines so much of what I have spent a lifetime loathing and opposing, preachiness, with great respect, piety, self-righteousness, heresy hunting, denunciation, shaming, assertion without evidence, accusation, inquisition, censoring. That's not why I'm incurring the wrath of my fellow liberals by standing on this side of the House. My real objection is that I don't think political correctness works. I want to get to the Golden Hill, but I don't think that's the way to get there. I believe one of the greatest human failings is to prefer to be right than to be effective. And political correctness is always obsessed with how right it is without thinking of how effective it might be. I wouldn't class myself as a classical libertarian, but I do relish transgression, and I deeply and instinctively distrust conformity and orthodoxy. Progress is not achieved by preachers and guardians of morality, but, to paraphrase Yevgeny Zamyatin, by madmen, hermits, heretics, dreamers, rebels, and skeptics. I may be wrong. I hope to learn this evening. I really do think I may be wrong, but I'm prepared to entertain the possibility that political correctness will bring us more tolerance and a better world. But I'm not sure, and I would like this quotation from my hero Bertrand Russell to hover over the evening. One of the painful things about our time is that those who feel certainty are stupid, and those with any imagination and understanding are filled with doubt and indecision. Let doubt prevail.
Well, I guess I would like to set out a challenge in somewhat the same format as Mr. Fry did to people on the moderate left. I mean, I've studied totalitarianism for a very long time, both on the left and on the right in various forms. And I think we've done a pretty decent job of determining when right-wing beliefs become dangerous. I think that they become dangerous when the people who stand on the right evoke notions of racial superiority or ethnic superiority, something like that. It's fairly easy to draw a box around them and place them to one side and necessary, and I think we've done a pretty good job of that. What I fail to see happening on the left, and this is with regards to the sensible left, because such a thing exists, is for the same thing to happen with regards to the radical leftists. Okay, so here's an open question. If it's not diversity, inclusivity, and equity as a triumvirate that mark out the too excessive left, and with equity defined, by the way, not as equality of opportunity, which is an absolutely laudable goal, but as equality of outcome, which is how it's defined, then exactly how do we demarcate the too extreme left? What do? We say, well, there's no such thing as the too extreme left. Well, that's certainly something that characterized much of intellectual thinking for the 20th century, as our high-order intellectuals, especially in places like France, did everything they could to bend over backwards to ignore absolutely everything that was happening in the catastrophic left world, in the Soviet Union and in Maoist China, not least. We've done a terrible job of determining how to demarcate what's useful from the left from what's pathological. And so it's perfectly okay for someone to criticize my attempts to identify something like a boundary. We could say diversity, inclusivity, and equity, especially equity, which is in fact equality of outcome, which is an absolutely abhorrent notion. If you know anything about history, you know that. And I'm perfectly willing to hear some reasonable alternatives. But what I hear continually from people on the left, first of all, as my opponents did, to construe every argument that is possibly able to be construed on the axis of group identification, and to fail to help the rest of us differentiate the reasonable left, which stands for the oppressed, necessarily, from the pathological left that's capable of unbelievable destruction. And what I see happening in the university campuses in particular, where the leftists absolutely predominate, and that's certainly not my imagination, that's well documented by perfectly reasonable people like Jonathan Haidt, is an absolute failure to make precisely that distinction. And I see the same thing echoed tonight. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to go here. No, it's interesting to hear that there really doesn't seem to be a problem, but yet I think we all instinctively know that there is some kind of problem. There isn't censorship. Of course not in the way that there is in Russia. I've been to Russia. I faced off with a deeply homophobic and unpleasant man, and there's political correctness in Russia. It's just political correctness on the right. And that's what I grew up with, political correctness, which meant that you couldn't say certain things on television. You couldn't say fuck, for example, on television, because it was incorrect to do so. And as always, the same reason was that someone would appear and say, I'm not shocked. Oh, of course, no, I'm not shocked. I'm not offended. I'm offended on behalf of others, young, impressionable, plastic minds, the vulnerable. And that's not good enough. It's so often people are saying, you see, I don't mind being called a faggot or a kike or whatever, or a mad person, because I've got mental health issues. I don't mind people insulting me. And people say, well, that's all right for you, Stephen, because you know you're strong. Well, I don't feel particularly strong, and I don't know that I like being called a faggot and a kike particularly, but I don't believe that the advances in my culture that have allowed me to marry, as I have now been for 3 years, to someone of my gender, I don't believe they are a result of political correctness. And maybe political correctness is actually just some sort of live trout, that the harder we squeeze it, the further it goes away. And you will be saying, I'm not talking about political correctness, you're talking about social justice, with which I agree, with whether you want to call it identity politics or the history of your people, the history of my people were slaves as well. Both the British were slaves of Romans and the Jews were slaves of the Egyptians. All human beings have been slaves at some point, and we all, in that sense, share that knowledge of how important it is to speak up. But Russell Means, who was a friend of mine towards the end, who founded the American Indian movement, he said, oh, for God's sake, call me an Indian or a Lakota Sioux or Russell. I don't care what you call me. It's how we're treated that matters. And so I'm really addressing a more popular idea. Also, actually, in Barrow, Alaska, an Inupiat said, call me an Eskimo. It's obviously easier for you because you keep mispronouncing Inupiat. You know, words do matter. I'll just end with a quick story. Gay rights came about in England because we slowly and persistently knocked on the door of people in power. We didn't shout, we didn't scream. People like Ian McKellen eventually got to see the Prime Minister. And when the Queen signed in the royal assent, as she has to, for the bill allowing equality of marriage, she said, Lord, you know, I couldn't imagine this in 1953. Really is extraordinary, isn't it? Just wonderful. And handed it over. Now, it's a nice story, and I hope it's true, but it's nothing to do with political correctness. It's to do with human decency. It's that simple.
Good point. Jordan, let's have you jump in on this idea of what you see as the pernicious danger of groupthink when it comes to ethnicity, when it comes to gender. Why do you think that's one of the primal sins, in your view, of quote, political correctness?
Well, I think it's one of the primal sins of identity politics players on the left and the right, just to be clear about that. Personally, since this has got personal at times, I'm no fan of the identitarian right. I think that anybody who plays a game, a conceptual game where group identity comes first and foremost, risks an exacerbation of tribalism. It doesn't matter whether it's on the left or the right. With regards to the idea of group rights, well, there's a fundamental, and this is something we've fallen into terribly in Canada, not least because we had to contend with the threat of Quebec separatism, but the idea of group rights is extraordinarily problematic because the obverse of the coin of individual rights is individual responsibilities. And you can hold an individual responsible, and an individual can be responsible. And so that's partly why individuals have rights. But groups, how do you hold a group responsible? I mean, the whole idea is it's not a good idea to hold a group responsible. First of all, it flies in the face of the idea of the sort of justice systems that we've laid out in the West that are essentially predicated first on the assumption of individual innocence, but also on the possibility of individual guilt, not group guilt. We saw what happened in the 20th century many, many times when the idea of group guilt was enabled to get a foothold, let's say, in the polity and in the justice system. It was absolutely catastrophic. And so, okay, fine, group rights. Well, how are you going to contend with the alternative to that, the opposite of that? Or where's the group responsibility? And how are you going to hold your groups responsible? Well, we don't have to talk about that because we're too concerned with rectifying historical injustices, hypothetical and otherwise. And that's certainly not to say that there weren't any shortage of absolutely catastrophic historical injustices. That's not the point. The point is how you view the situation at the most fundamental level. And group rights are an absolute catastrophe, in my opinion.
Let's have Stephen come in on this. This is part of your opening remarks. You're a category creep, Stephen. Can you respond to that?
It's a nice... I'm still very lost about why we aren't talking about political correctness. We're talking about politics, and that's fine. And I share exactly what you think about it. I'm not an enemy of identity politics per se. I can obviously see where it goes wrong and where it's annoying. Let's be empirical about this. How well is it working for you in America at the moment? Well, not well at all. Really isn't. Right. You can answer me in a moment. The reason that Trump and Brexit in Britain and all kinds of nativists all over Europe are succeeding is not the triumph of the right. It's the catastrophic failure of the left. It's our fault. We absolutely... My point is not that I've turned to the right or anything like that, or that I'm nice and fluffy and want everybody to be decent. I'm saying, fuck political correctness. Resist. Fight. If you have a point of view, fight it in the proper manner, using democracy as it should be, not channels of education, not language. You know, it's so silly. But there's a chess rule, you know. In chess, the best move to play in chess is not the best chess move. It's the move your opponent least wants you to play. At the moment, you're being recruiting sergeants for the right. By annoying and upsetting, and instead of fighting, either fighting or persuading. But political correctness is a middle course that simply doesn't work.
Well, first of all, you said be empirical. Now, empirical, as far as I know, the word means that which can be verified or falsified through the census.
Exactly.
So if we look at it in an objective way, the reality is that people don't have equal access to the means to articulate the very moment you're talking about.
I'm talking about the empirical results of this political attitude.
I understand that, but my point is simply this. I'm suggesting to you that people use the weapons at hand. Now, it was Abraham Joshua Heschel, the rabbi, who said everybody's not guilty, but everybody's responsible. Right? That's a distinction there. Everybody clearly is not guilty, but what's interesting, look at the flip side. If you have benefited from 300 years of holding people in servitude, thinking that you did it all on your own, why can't these people work harder? Let me see, for 300 years, you ain't had no job. So the reality is, for 300 years, you hold people in the bands. You hold them in subordination. You refuse to give them rights. Then all of a sudden, you free them and say you're now individuals, not having the skills, not having the skills. I'm talking about America, first of all. I'm talking about American society, first of all. I'm talking about the Northern Hemisphere. I'm talking about every society where enslavement has existed, but I'm speaking specifically of the repudiation of individual rights among people of color in America who were denied the opportunity to be individuals. So I obviously and ideally, and I think Michelle Goldberg does too, agree with the emphasis on individuals. What we're saying to you is that we have not been permitted to be individuals. We have not been permitted to exercise our individual autonomy and authority, and the refusal to do so, to recognize me as an individual, means when you roll up on me and I'm a 12-year-old boy in a park and you shoot first in ways you do to black kids that you don't do to white kids, you are not treating that person as an individual. If we're living in a society where women are subject to aberrant forms of horrid, patriarchal, sexist, and misogynist behavior, you are not acknowledging the centrality of the individuality of women. You are treating them according to a group dynamic. And if we get beyond the ability of people on the right to understand the degree to which they have operated from the basis of benefit from group identity, without having said, I'll end by saying this. The great American philosopher Beyonce Knowles said that it has been said that racism is so American that if you challenge racism, you look like you're challenging America. We are challenging inequality. We are challenging the refusal to see me as an individual. When we overcome that, have at it, we're all on equal plane.
I think it's fine. I think it's good.
The pot is getting stirred here.
So I've got a couple of questions.
So let's your side spoke, so I'm going to go to Jordan, then to you,
Let's
Michelle.
assume for a moment that I've benefited from my white privilege. Okay, so let's assume that. That's
a good
fine.
Assumption. That's
yeah,
good
well,
assumption.
that's what you would say. So, so let's say, here, let's get precise about this, okay?
Was that very individual of you?
Let's get precise about this, okay?
Let's get precise.
To what degree is my present level of attainment or achievement a consequence of my white privilege? And I don't mean sort of. I mean, do you mean 5%? Do you mean 15%? Do you mean 25%? Do you mean 75%? And what do you propose I do about it? How about a tax? How about a tax that's like specialized for me so that I can account for my damn privilege, so that I can stop hearing about it? Now, let's get precise about one other thing, okay? We'll get precise about one other thing. Now,
Precise.
yeah, precise, yes. And so, if we can agree, and we haven't, that the left can go too far, which it clearly can, then how would my worthy opponents precisely define when the left that they stand for has gone too far? You didn't like equity, equality of outcome. I think that's a great marker. But if you have a better suggestion and won't sidestep the question, so let's figure out how I can dispense with my white privilege, and so that you can tell me when the left has gone too far, since they clearly can. And that's what this debate is about political correctness. It's about the left going too far. And I think it's gone too far in many ways. And I'd like to figure out exactly how and when, so the reasonable left could make its ascendance again and we could quit all this nonsense.
So, Mike, I want to come to you on those, great, Michelle, on Jordan's point about how does he, in a sense, get an equal voice in this debate back if it is implied that his participation brings with it this baggage of white privilege that doesn't allow him to see clearly the issues that are before us.
But that is to be complicit in the very problem itself terminologically. You're beginning at a point that's already productive and controversial. You're saying, how can he get his equality back? Who are you talking about? Jordan Peterson, trending #1 on Twitter? Jordan Peterson, with an international bestseller? I want him to tweet something out about me in my book. Jordan Peterson, right? This is what I'm saying to you. Why the rage, bruh? You're doing well, but you're a mean, mad white man. And you're going to get us right. And I have never seen so much wine and snowflaking. There's enough wine in here to start a vineyard. And what I'm saying to you empirically and precisely, when you ask the question about white privilege, the fact that you ask it in the way you did, dismissive, pseudoscientific, non-empirical, and without justification, the truth is that white privilege doesn't act according to quantifiable segments. It's about the degree to which we are willing as a society to grapple with the ideals of freedom, justice, and equality upon which it's based. Number two, what's interesting to me, you're talking about not having a collective identity. What do you call a nation? Are you Canadian? Are you Canadian by yourself? Are you an individual, or are you part of a group? When America formed its union it did so in opposition to another group. So the reality is that those who are part of group identities in politics deny the legitimacy and validity of those groups and the fact that they have been created thusly, and then have resentment against others. All I'm asking for is the opportunity. The quotation you talk about, the difference between equality of outcome and equality of opportunity, that's a staid and retried argument, hackneyed phrase derived from the halcyon days of the debate over affirmative action. Are you looking for outcomes that can be determined equally, or are you looking for opportunity? If you free a person after a whole long time of oppression and say now you are free to survive, if you have no skills, if you have no quantifiable means of existence, what you have done is liberated them into oppression. And all I'm suggesting to you, Lyndon Baines Johnson, one of our great presidents, said, if you start a man in a race 100 years behind, it is awfully difficult to catch up. So I don't think Jordan Peterson is suffering from anything except an exaggerated sense of entitlement and resentment, and his own privilege is invisible to him, and it's manifest with lethal intensity and ferocity right here on stage.
Jordan, I'm going to have to let you respond to that if you wish.
Well, what I derive from that series of rebuttals, let's say, is twofold. The first is that saying that the radical left goes too far when they engage in violence is not a sufficient response by any stretch of the imagination, because there are sets of ideas in radical leftist thinking that led to the catastrophes of the 20th century, and that was at the level of idea, not at the level of violent action. It's a very straightforward thing to say you're against violence. It's like being against poverty. It's like, you know, generically speaking, decent people are against poverty and violence. It doesn't address the issue in the least. And with regards to my privilege or lack thereof, I mean, I'm not making the case that I haven't had advantages in my life and disadvantages in my life like most people. You don't know anything about my background or where I came from, and it doesn't matter to you because fundamentally I'm a mean white man. That's a hell of a thing to say in a debate.
Let me just say.
Very, very brief, because I want to move on to men and women. A good topic next.
The mean mad white comment was not predicated upon my historical excavation of your past. It's based upon the evident vitriol with which you speak and the denial of a sense of equanimity among combatants in an argument. So I'm saying again, you're a mean mad white man, and the viciousness is evident.
Okay. Let's reset on this. Are we in a cultural panic? Is the response, as Michelle says, commensurate with the moment?
I'm very confused by this. Of course, I recognize the bestiality of Weinstein and the monstrosity of his behavior, and it was shocking to me. I actually worked for him. Script doctoring, as it's called. I never had the bathroom towel, but for pretty obvious reasons. But it's, grotesque, and I can't imagine how vile it must be for such a powerful man, and he was. I used to play a game at the Cannes Film Festival where, in his years of power, we're walking from one hotel at the end there, all the way up to the Palais de Festival. You would get 10 points every time you heard the word Harvey. And you'd usually, a 10-minute walk, you'd have 300 points. Because it was, Harvey's got the script, Harvey's got it. I've got a meeting with Harvey at the Majestic in the afternoon. He was immensely powerful. And I think that's obvious that someone in that position, abusing and threatening and hindering the livelihood of women is grotesque in the extreme. But I have to tell you, there is genuine feeling amongst many people I know that we can't speak our minds. We can't actually speak to the true nuance, the true depth of sexual, romantic feeling between men and women. It's not a subject I'm absolutely expert on, but it counts between men and men as well, though I know when it's men and men, you might say, well, that's different because women have had a different experience in history, and I don't want to enter that particular field, but I would say that there is real fear in my business, which is where this all started, show business, acting, and so on, yeah, people are rather afraid to speak about a piece of, publicity that's come out or a statement that's been made. You just go, yep, absolutely, and wait for the people to leave the room before you can speak honestly with your friends. And I've never experienced that in my entire 60 years on this planet. This feeling that, and I'm not characterizing feminists as in East German, but it's like that, the Stasi are listening. You better be careful, they're listening. And that's a genuine feeling. I'm saying that with my hand on my heart. I'm not saying it to make a point other than the fact that it's true and it's worrying. But the sexual misadventures and horror experience is worrying too. So there are two worries, and they're not solved.
Let's bring Jordan in on this, because you've written and commented about a lot. But Stephen, thank you for having us ready.
Well, I think I'm going to point out two things again. The first is that my question about when the left goes too far still hasn't been answered. And then the second thing I'm going to point out is that, it's conceivable that I am a mean man. I mean, maybe I'm meaner than some people and not as mean as others. I think that's probably more the case. But I would say the fact that race got dragged into that particular comment is a better exemplar of what the hell I think is wrong with the politically correct left than anything else that could have possibly happened.
That was fun. Imagine the hurt, the anxiety, the insult that you might genuinely feel, according to what I felt was an appropriate comment of description at the moment of its expression. But imagine now those hurt feelings and
Not hurt.
Okay, you feel great. You feel great about it.
That's really different. I'm not a
Right.
victim. I'm not hurt. I'm
You're
appalled.
not hurt. Okay, you wouldn't be a victim. So what's interesting is that whatever non-traditional feelings of empathy you endure at this particular point, the point is, imagine then the horrors that so many others have had to put up with for so long when they are refused to acknowledge their humanity. Now, I take your point seriously.
So your group
let me finish. Let me finish, though. Let me finish.
To me.
Let me finish, sir.
That figures.
You're not my inquisitioner, okay? What I'm saying to you is that when you said you were upset that I added the element of race there, right? When I said mean, mad, white man. Well, what's interesting is that you may have felt that you were being ascribed a group identity to which you do not subscribe. You may have felt that you were being unfairly judged according to your particular race. You may have felt that your individual identity was being besmirched by my rather careless characterization of you, all of which qualifies for a legitimate, response to me, but also the point we've been trying to make about the refusal to see our individual existence as women, as people of color, as First Nation people, and the like. My point simply has been, the reason I talked about race in that particular characterization, because there's a particular way in which I have come to a city. I don't know if there are a lot of black people out here, not sure. But I constantly come to places and spaces that are not my natural habitat, other than intellectual engagement and the love and the fury of rhetorical engagement, yes. But I often go into hostile spaces where people will not vote in favor for my particular viewpoint because I'm interested as an individual of breaking down barriers so that people can understand just how complicated it is. So what I'm saying to you is that I would invite you, in terms of the surrender of your privilege, to give you a specific response. Come with me to a Black Baptist church. Come with me to a historically black college. Come to me to an indigenous or First Nations community where we're able to engage in some of the lovely conversation, but also to listen and hear. And when I added race to that, I was talking about the historically evinced inability to acknowledge others' pains equally to the one that they are presently enduring. So, as a human being, I love you as my brother, but I stand by my comment.
Well, I've seen the sorts of things that you're talking about. I happen to be an honorary member of an indigenous family, So don't tell me about what I should go see with regards to oppression.
You asked me
don't
a
know
question, I gave
anything
you a
about
response.
me.
You asked me a question, I gave you a response.
Yeah. You gave me a generic response, a
It's not
generic
It's tailored
race-based
towards
response.
you. Jordan Peterson, I would like for you to come with me, Michael Eric Dyson, to a Black Baptist church. You been to one of those?
I would be happy to do that. By the
Okay,
way.
all right, I'm gonna hook you up. I'm gonna hook you up.
Okay,
all right?
good. We'll make sure that happens. One more quick round, and then we're going to go to closing statements. And Stephen Fry, I want to get your response to why, a generation from now, looking back on this debate, we're not going to see this, quote, so-called politically correct movement in the same way, let's say, that we now understand the positive contributions of the civil rights movement. That was a movement that advanced a series of ideas about human dignity to people who previously didn't have that dignity. We're now having another debate, another social debate about different groups and communities we're trying to convey a sense of new dignity to them. Why won't this be, in a sense, looked back upon as something positive a generation from now?
I think people will look back on this debate and wonder why political correctness wasn't discussed. I said it was slippery. I mean, it's interesting to hear talk about race and about gender and about equality, and it's something that I've thought about a lot and I can learn a great deal about, but that's not why I came to this debate. I was interested in what I've always been interested in, the suppression of language and thought, the closing down, the rationalist idea that seems beguiling, that if you limit people's language, it may somehow teach them a different way of thinking. Something that would have delighted the inventors of George Orwell's Newspeak, for example. And it seems to me it's just implausible. It doesn't work. And that's what I mean by empirical. It doesn't stand an empirical test. It isn't experientially validated, as we see from the political landscape now, and I worry that we may in the future. So I'm sort of disappointed that the subject has just revolved around academia, which was predictable, because that's the sort of crucible in which these elements are mixed. But even more disappointed that really I haven't heard from Michel or from Professor Dyson as to what they think political correctness is, because what they've talked about is basically saying progress, in our view, is progress. Well, I agree. That's, yeah. So it is too. And good on progress. But how is it that you're saying that what we call political correctness, you call progress? That's what you're supposed to be arguing. I want to know what you mean by political correctness.
Well, okay. So like I said, the reason a few months ago, right, you contacted me, asked if I wanted to do a debate about identity politics, and then you presented me with this resolution, and I said, well, there's a lot of things that people call political correctness that I'm not going to defend. But then I realized who I was debating and saw that there was a lot of things that you, Jordan Peterson, call political correctness that I call progress. And to some extent, you too, Stephen Fry, when you talk about it being outrageous to tear down, or not outrageous, I won't put words in your mouth, but that we shouldn't be tearing down statues of kind of notorious racists, that we should just instead be throwing eggs at them. So those sorts of things, if you call them political correctness, I call them progress. Now, this feeling of being silenced, which I understand, although it seems very vague, right? You kind of are not quite putting your finger on who is silencing you, except for a vague fear that if you say something untoward, you're going to be the subject of, I'm not sure.
Yes.
Shaming, but by who?
Yeah.
But by what? By the internet?
I'm not saying their names.
No, but I mean,
point. I'm scared.
but
if
you're
I listed,
but
that's
again,
the point.
You're scared.
It is a culture of
right.
fear.
I understand there's that element of fear. What I'm saying is that it's a feeling. It's a feeling that is this sort of intangible result of, I think, primarily.
We've all seen the sort of show trial thing where the person then apologizes. I have so much to learn about sexual politics. I am really sorry. Signed a lawyer, crossed out the name of the person. You think the real mistake of our left is that we underestimate the right. The right isn't as stupid as we'd like them to be. If only they were. If only they weren't so cunning, so sly, so smart, so aware of our shortcomings. And I just fear that political correctness is a weapon that they value, that the more we tell the world how people should be treated, how language should be treated, what words are acceptable, what attitudes are acceptable, what HR meeting is going to tell you in a long bullet-pointed list about how you look at people. All of this is meat and drink to bad people, to malefactors, to bad actors. I'm not counting myself as one of those bad actors in that sense. I mean bad actors in the other sense.
Right, So there are, like I said, there are a lot of ways in which I agree with you, although I would like to hear, I mean, to turn it back on you, I would like to hear you say, you know, what are the words that have fallen into disrepute that you think we should be resurrecting, right? I mean, to me, this is this area of like hotly contested social change right now, where a lot of people feel
it's about words that have gone into disuse. It's very often phrases, jargonistic slogans, heteronormative, cisgendered, those kind of things. They're just an insult. You know, imagine you're a young student arriving at university and someone's bombarding you with this preposterous hermeneutical nonsense from misread textbooks, misread Foucault, if I may say, and misread Derrida, and so on. Because I was at Cambridge, England, doing English literature. We had our French phase, and there's value in that. It's an interesting game, and it is. It's a place to. I think I'd just really say that the ghost hovering over me it's a letter Oscar Wilde wrote, and he said to Bosie, his love, he said, the fact that you didn't get a degree is nothing, but you never acquired what is sometimes called the Oxford manner, and I'll say for that, the university manner. He said, Oscar said, I take that to mean the ability to play gracefully with ideas. I think that's disappearing from our culture, and I think it's a terrible thing.
When I come into arenas like this, I understand that my back is up against the wall. But
come and sit over here.
I want to sit on your lap. I want to sit on your lap in a while. But what I'm saying to you, but don't get excited. But what I'm saying to you,
don't flatter yourself.
Oh, that's all right. I see how you've been looking at me.
You know, you want me to define, or one of us to talk about when the left goes too far. And if I'm, you know, I certainly don't want to be a woman putting words in your mouth, but if I hear you correctly, what you're saying is that you want me to kind of renounce Marxist categories, or to...
It's up to you.
Well,
I just want you to do it. I want you to define when the left goes too far. You can do it any way you want.
Like I said, I think that the left goes too far when it is violent or censorious, when it tries to shut people down or no platform them, or when it acts violently. I'm not sure what you expect
Something
beyond
deeper.
that. Something deeper, how?
Yeah. Well, I'd like you to contend with the set of left-wing ideas that produced all the left-wing pathologies of the 20th century, and to define how you think standard left-wing thinking, which has a valuable place, goes too far, since it obviously does.
Has the right gone too far? Has the right gone too far?
Of course the right has gone
Tell
too
us
far.
how.
Well, how about Auschwitz?
I mean...
Well, I was talking about 20th century
right?
politics.
What else? More recently, what has gone wrong with the right?
Look, I don't like identity politics players at all. I don't care whether they're on the left or the right. I've been lecturing about right-wing extremism for 30 years. I'm no fan of the right, despite the fact that the left would like to paint me that way because it's more convenient for them.
How has the right gone too far recently?
Well, where? It's threatening to go too far in identitarian Europe, that's for sure. It's gone too far in Charlottesville. It went too far in Norway. Like, how long a list do you want? And why am I required to produce that? To show you that I don't like the identitarian right?
I just thought I'd ask you.
I was actually asking you a question. So your assumption is somehow that I must be on the side of the right. It's like, look, the right hasn't occupied the humanities and the social sciences. It's as simple as that for me. If they had, I'd be objecting to them.
Say that again. I didn't hear that.
The right has not occupied the social sciences and the humanities. And the left clearly has. The statistical evidence for that is overwhelming.
Sir, what about IQ testing in terms of genetic inheritance? I'm
Sorry,
just
we're
saying.
here to talk about political correctness, and we've done a damn poor job
Oh,
of
I
it.
see. I gave you an example.
Okay,
Now you
let's,
can't answer it.
let's
Okay,
all then
all right.
redeem ourselves with our closing statements. I'm going to put 3 minutes on the clock.
So I'm not here to claim that there's no such thing as oppression, unfairness, brutality, discrimination, unfair use of power, all of those. Anyone with any sense knows that hierarchical structures tilt towards tyranny, and that we have to be constantly wakeful to ensure that all they are isn't power and tyranny. It's interesting to hear Foucault referred to. It's unfortunate, but it's interesting. You know, because Foucault, like his French intellectual confreres, essentially believed that the only basis upon which hierarchies were established is power. And that's part of this pernicious politically correct doctrine that I've been speaking about. When a hierarchy becomes corrupt, then the only way to ascend it is to exercise power. That's essentially the definition of a tyranny. But that doesn't mean that the imperfect hierarchies that we have constructed in our relatively free countries, which at least tilt somewhat towards competence and ability, as evidenced by the staggering achievements of civilization that we've managed to produce, it doesn't mean that the appropriate way of diagnosing them is to assume without reservation unidimensionally that they're all about power, and as a consequence everyone who occupies any position within them is a tyrant or a tyrant in the making. And that is certainly the fundamental claim of someone like Foucault. And it's part and parcel of this, what would you call it, this ideological catastrophe that's political correctness. I'm not here to argue against progress. I'm not here to argue against equality of opportunity. Anyone with any sense understands that even if you're selfish, you're best served by allowing yourself access to the multiplicitous talents of everyone, and to discriminate against them for arbitrary reasons unrelated to their competences. It's abhorrent. That has nothing to do with the issue at hand. It isn't that good things haven't happened in the past and should continue to happen. That's not the point. The point is the point my compatriot Fry made, which is, well, we can agree on the catastrophe and we can agree on the historic inequity, but there's no way I'm going to agree that political correctness is the way to address any of that. And there's plenty of evidence to the contrary, some of which I would say was displayed quite clearly tonight.
Gentlemen, thank you. Thank you both. We're just going to do a quick discussion with the online audience who's watching right now, just to get your reactions to the debate. And maybe to start with you, Jordan. There were some heated moments here. Did that surprise you, that the exchanges that you had with Michael Eric Dyson?
Well, I wouldn't say it surprised me. Well, I suppose it probably did. It just didn't seem like a very good tactical move. You know, and I stand by what I said. I don't see any reason at all that my racial identity needed to be dragged into the discussion, independent of my personality proclivity. I would say what I just said to Mr. Fry here is that it was a pleasure sharing the stage with him. I've rarely heard anyone ever deliver their convictions with such a remarkable sense of passion and wit and forbearance and erudition. It was really something.
Yeah. And Stephen, a challenging debate because in a sense we're trying to mesh two different views here, two different worldviews, one very focused more on identity politics, group identity. You, in a sense, having an argument really more about the larger culture itself and the tenor and tone of the conversation
I
within
worried
it.
that I was being a little kind of scattergun, really, and that both scattergun and too specific, that I had just taken very literally the popular idea of political correctness as being a kind of control of language and a shutting down of certain phrases or an introduction of others, and the kind of day-to-day, as I say, human resource departments of corporations and that sort of thing, so I was slightly disappointed that it just became a debate about race and about gender and so on. But that was, I guess, natural. And I still, the fact is I'm still a lefty, but a soft one. I just don't have...
I'm not too soft.
Flabby, squashy in every sense. And I realize that that's not a political point of view, it is a personal one.
Right.
And the gap between the personal and the political, which is a space you're obviously very interested in as a psychologist, is one that is rarely explored. People are either so personal that it has no application in the outside world and the organization of human affairs, or they're so political and so much to do with structure and distinction between hierarchies and networks and so on, that they forget the individual. And that's the space in which the impassioned liberal lives, and it's not easy to do it because you often do sound rather wet, and I'm aware that I did. But I enjoyed it.
Yeah,
I really
thank you for coming. Just finally, before I free you two both to a well-earned drink, anything left unsaid, Jordan? Any point that you wanted to make that you didn't feel you had the time or the opportunity?
No, I
You
don't
said your
think
piece?
so. I said
Okay.
my piece, yeah.
Great. Same question to you, Stephen.
I know, I think I got across. I mean, there's so much you can talk about in that field, and I just wanted to leave with the point that I do want, like everybody, it's a no-brainer. We want the world to be fairer, juster, sweeter, kinder, but it's how you get there, and I felt that wasn't really addressed.
Okay.